By the autumn of 1944, the German war machine was no longer being destroyed first on the battlefield. It was being strangled in its fuel lines. For years, Nazi Germany had built its military strategy around speed. Blitzkrieg depended on movement, tanks rushing through enemy lines, mechanized infantry advancing behind them, aircraft striking ahead of the columns. But all of it, every tank tread, every truck convoy, every fighter sortie, ran on fuel. And by late 1944, Germany was running out of it. Unlike the United States and the Soviet Union, Germany possessed no vast natural oil reserves. Before the war, much of its petroleum had come from imports, particularly from Romania's Ploiești oil fields and from trade agreements that no longer existed once Europe was engulfed in war. To compensate, Germany invested heavily in synthetic fuel production, turning coal into gasoline through industrial chemical processes. It was an engineering achievement, but also a dangerous weakness. Synthetic fuel plants were massive, fixed targets. The Allies understood this. Beginning in 1944, American and British bombers launched sustained campaigns against Germany's oil infrastructure. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and other industrial centers were pounded repeatedly from the air. The raids were devastating. Entire refinery complexes burned for days. Storage tanks erupted into towering fireballs visible for miles. Rail yards feeding the plants were cratered into twisted wreckage. Production collapsed. German officials tried to hide the scale of the disaster, but frontline commanders saw the truth every day. Panzer divisions that once trained constantly could no longer afford exercises. Tank crews sat idle beside their vehicles because fuel allocations had been slashed. Luftwaffe pilots, many barely trained replacements by this stage of the war, received only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had enjoyed. Veteran officers watched in disbelief as new pilots were sent into combat with minimal preparation, simply because aviation fuel had become too precious to waste. The shortages reached every corner of the Wehrmacht. Truck convoys were abandoned because there was no diesel to move them. Horses, thought to be relics of an earlier age, returned in huge numbers to haul artillery and supplies. Entire mechanized formations increasingly depended on animal transport, a humiliating regression for an army that had once terrified Europe with its mobility. Even elite units were forced to ration every drop. One German officer later recalled that fuel had become more valuable than ammunition. Tanks could survive without firing for a day. Without gasoline, they became useless steel bunkers. By the summer of 1944, the crisis had worsened further. Romania, Germany's most important external source of oil, was slipping away. Soviet offensives surged into Eastern Europe, threatening the Ploiești fields that had supplied the Reich for years. Then, in August, Romania switched sides. Overnight, Germany lost access to one of its last major oil lifelines. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. High Command began issuing orders that bordered on desperation. Fuel reserves were centralized and released only for critical operations. Training was curtailed almost completely. Non-essential vehicle movements were banned. Some units were ordered to destroy perfectly usable trucks simply because there was no fuel to justify keeping them. On paper, Germany still had tanks, trucks, and aircraft. In reality, much of that equipment was immobilized. Field commanders understood what this meant long before many civilians did. Germany was not merely losing battles, it was losing the ability to wage modern war. Then came the Western Front. After the Allied landings in Normandy and the breakout from France, German units retreating across Europe faced a nightmare. Vehicles were abandoned by the roadside not because they were damaged, but because their tanks were empty. Mechanics cannibalized immobilized trucks and half-tracks for parts, leaving skeletal columns of ruined machinery behind retreating forces. Allied soldiers advancing east frequently encountered German armor simply left in fields, abandoned by crews who had no way to move them. Yet Hitler refused to accept the strategic reality. He continued demanding offensives, counterattacks, and impossible maneuvers from armies that could barely keep their engines running. Generals were ordered to launch attacks with fuel reserves that would last only days sometimes hours. Officers at every level understood the absurdity. Even when local victories were possible, there was no logistical foundation to sustain them. Morale suffered accordingly. German soldiers at the front could see the contrast. American and British forces advanced with endless convoys of trucks, fuel tankers, and supply vehicles stretching for miles. Allied aircraft filled the skies in overwhelming numbers. Their tanks moved freely, their artillery never seemed to run out of shells, and their mechanized columns rolled forward with an industrial confidence Germany could no longer match. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. One captured Allied depot might provide temporary relief. One seized fuel convoy might keep a battalion moving for another day. But everyone in command knew the truth. Germany was now fighting an enemy whose logistical power dwarfed anything the Reich could replace. By late 1944, fuel had become more than a supply problem. It had become a symbol of the war's irreversible direction. Every German commander who studied the reports could see the numbers. Allied oil production was immense. American industry alone produced more fuel than Germany could ever hope to destroy, capture, or replicate. Even if a German unit found thousands of gallons in enemy depots, it would not matter strategically. It was a sip of water in a burning desert. And so the Wehrmacht entered the final phase of the war trapped in a paradox. It still possessed formidable weapons, experienced officers, and disciplined troops, but lacked the fuel to use them effectively. The great mechanized army that had once thundered across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union was grinding to a halt. Its tanks remained powerful. Its guns still deadly. Its soldiers still dangerous. But without fuel, the machinery of Blitzkrieg had become an empty shell. For some officers, the realization came gradually through reports and shortages. For others, it arrived in a single unforgettable moment, when even a massive captured stockpile of enemy fuel no longer looked like salvation, but proof that Germany's enemies possessed resources beyond anything the Reich could overcome. And for one German colonel, that moment would come when he stood before 50,000 gallons of captured American gasoline and understood that it changed nothing. In December 1944, as snow and fog swallowed the forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler gambled on one final major offensive in the West. The operation was bold to the point of desperation. German armored forces would smash through the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a political settlement before Germany collapsed completely. It was a plan built on speed. And speed required fuel Germany did not have. From the very beginning, the offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was haunted by a brutal reality. Many German tank crews were issued fuel for only part of the operation. Some commanders received maps marked not merely with objectives, but with locations of expected American supply dumps. The plan assumed German spearheads would capture Allied fuel as they advanced. In effect, the Wehrmacht was betting the entire offensive on taking gasoline from the enemy. Among the formations leading the assault was Kampfgruppe Paper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte. Commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, the unit was tasked with driving rapidly through the Ardennes, bypassing resistance, and pushing as far west as possible. Paper's column included some of Germany's most formidable armored vehicles: Tiger II heavy tanks, Panthers, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, and mechanized infantry. But even before the attack began, Paper's men knew their fuel situation was precarious. Vehicles had been loaded with carefully rationed gasoline. Drivers were ordered to conserve every drop. Engines were shut down whenever possible despite the freezing cold. Officers warned that if the advance stalled, fuel shortages would become catastrophic within days. Then, in the chaos of the offensive's opening phase, fortune seemed to smile on the Germans. As Paper's column drove westward through the Belgian countryside, his men overran elements of the retreating American forces near the town of Bulge. There, scattered among abandoned vehicles and hasty defensive positions, they discovered something almost unbelievable: a large American fuel depot left behind in the confusion of the retreat. The Germans rushed forward in disbelief. Fuel drums, tanker trucks, and stockpiles of gasoline sat waiting, tens of thousands of gallons of desperately needed fuel. American troops had withdrawn so quickly under the pressure of the German advance that they had not destroyed the cache before abandoning it. For the Germans, it was like finding treasure in the middle of a frozen battlefield. Men shouted with excitement. Drivers and mechanics immediately began refueling every vehicle they could. Jerry cans were filled by hand. Tankers were seized and redirected. Staff officers rapidly calculated what the haul meant for the advance. Here, at last, was the resource the offensive had been starving for. According to post-war accounts, the captured fuel amounted to roughly 50,000 gallons, an extraordinary windfall for a German armored force operating on fumes. For ordinary soldiers in the column, the discovery felt miraculous. One officer described the mood as euphoric. Men who had feared their vehicles would soon be abandoned now believed the offensive might succeed after all. The fuel meant tanks could continue forward, trucks could keep carrying ammunition and infantry. The spearhead had been given new life. But amid the celebration, experienced commanders saw the situation differently. They understood that 50,000 gallons, while enormous by the standards of a single Kampfgruppe, was not enough to solve Germany's larger problem. Modern armored warfare consumed fuel at staggering rates. A heavy Tiger II tank could burn fuel so rapidly that even a full tank provided only limited operational range, especially in winter conditions and rough terrain. An entire armored column devoured gasoline every hour it moved. Still, in that moment, practical necessity overruled strategic doubt. Paper ordered the captured fuel distributed immediately. Vehicles were topped off. Reserve containers were packed wherever space allowed. The column resumed its westward drive, reinvigorated by the belief that perhaps the offensive still had momentum. Yet the fuel cache brought problems of its own. Much of the gasoline was American, and not all German vehicles could use it efficiently without issues. The hurried transfer process slowed the column. Congested roads, destroyed bridges, and mounting American resistance further delayed the advance. Every hour spent refueling and reorganizing cost precious time, the one commodity Hitler's offensive could least afford to lose. And the Americans were recovering quickly. Initial shock had given way to organized resistance. U.S. engineers destroyed bridges. Infantry established roadblocks in villages. Artillery and air power, once the weather improved, began hammering the narrow roads the Germans relied upon. What had been intended as a lightning breakthrough increasingly became a grinding fight for every mile. The captured fuel had bought time. It had not bought victory. Still, to the soldiers in the spearhead, the depot remained one of the most dramatic moments of the campaign. They had seized from the richest industrial power in the world the very lifeblood of mechanized war. For a brief moment, it seemed like proof that daring and aggression could still overcome material disadvantage. But some officers, particularly senior ones, looked at the American stockpile with a more sobering perspective. The sheer size of the depot was itself alarming. For Germany, 50,000 gallons was a strategic prize worth celebrating. For the United States Army, it was merely one supply point among countless others feeding the Allied advance across Europe. The Americans could lose such a cache and replace it. Germany could capture it and still remain desperate. That contrast was impossible to ignore. The Germans had staked a major offensive on finding enemy fuel by chance. Their opponent had so much gasoline that entire depots could be abandoned in retreat and still not cripple operations. What looked to the Wehrmacht like a miracle was, to the Americans, a temporary logistical setback. As Paper's armored column rolled onward, fueled by captured American gasoline, some German officers began to grasp the deeper meaning of what they had found. The depot was not merely a fortunate prize. It was evidence of the overwhelming industrial and logistical imbalance between Germany and the Allies. The enemy possessed fuel in quantities the Reich could barely imagine. And if Germany now had to steal gasoline from American depots just to keep its tanks moving for another day, what did that say about the true state of the war? For one German commander, that realization would become impossible to dismiss. Standing amid the captured fuel, watching his men celebrate a supply haul that America could replace almost effortlessly, he began to understand that the offensive's greatest success so far was also proof of its hopelessness. Germany had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, and yet the Reich was still running on borrowed time. The captured American fuel depot should have been a moment of triumph. For the German armored spearheads pushing through the Ardennes in December 1944, 50,000 gallons of gasoline represented more than just supply, it represented survival. Without fuel, the offensive would grind to a halt. Without mobility, Germany's final gamble in the West would collapse before reaching its objectives. Yet for the officers who understood the broader war, the sight of that fuel told a different story. Among them was a German colonel attached to the advancing armored forces, one of several senior commanders responsible for evaluating whether the offensive still had a realistic chance of success. He watched as trucks, tanks, and half-tracks lined up to refuel from captured American stores. Soldiers cheered, mechanics shouted over the engines, staff officers updated movement estimates with renewed optimism. But instead of relief, the colonel felt something colder than the Ardennes winter. He understood numbers. He knew how much fuel a mechanized army consumed in modern war. A single armored division could burn through enormous quantities in a matter of days, sometimes hours during heavy operations. 50,000 gallons looked massive to exhausted frontline troops, but to a strategist, it was temporary relief, not salvation. He reportedly remarked to those around him that the true meaning of the captured depot was not that Germany had been saved, but that Germany was finished. His reasoning was brutally simple. If the United States Army could abandon a fuel stockpile that large in retreat and continue fighting without strategic disruption, then American logistics had reached a scale Germany could no longer compete with. The Reich had launched its greatest remaining armored reserves into battle partly dependent on capturing enemy gasoline. The Americans could lose tens of thousands of gallons and keep moving. That disparity spoke louder than any battlefield report. To the colonel, the depot was not evidence of German success. It was evidence of Allied abundance. For years, German commanders had hoped that superior tactics, discipline, and operational skill could offset the industrial might of the Allies. Blitzkrieg had once made that belief seem true. In 1939 and 1940, Germany had crushed larger or better-equipped opponents through speed and coordination. Even on the Eastern Front, German forces had inflicted devastating defeats despite Soviet numerical superiority. But by late 1944, the mathematics of war had changed. The United States was producing tanks, trucks, aircraft, and fuel at a scale beyond comprehension for most German officers. American oil fields and refineries generated quantities of petroleum that dwarfed the total consumption of entire European armies. The Soviet Union continued pushing west with endless reserves of men and materiel. Britain remained an unsinkable base for Allied power. Germany, by contrast, was scraping together enough gasoline for one offensive. And even that offensive depended on theft. The colonel watched his men celebrate the fuel cache and understood the deeper humiliation. Germany's once proud mechanized army had become reliant on enemy mistakes to function. If American logistics had been slightly more organized, if the depot had been destroyed before retreat, the offensive might have stalled far sooner. That was not the foundation of victory. That was the behavior of an army on the edge of collapse. His realization was reinforced as the advance continued. Despite the captured fuel, progress remained slow. Narrow roads clogged with vehicles created traffic jams stretching for miles. Destroyed bridges forced lengthy detours. American engineers and rearguard units turned small villages into defensive strongpoints. Every delay burned more gasoline. Every wrong turn, every stop-and-go movement, every tank forced to idle in frozen traffic consumed the precious resource the Germans had fought so hard to seize. And overhead, whenever the weather cleared, Allied aircraft returned. Fighter bombers roared over roads and crossroads, strafing columns and destroying fuel trucks. What had looked like renewed momentum quickly became another brutal lesson in reality. Even captured fuel could not overcome Allied control of the skis, superior logistics, and mounting battlefield resistance. The colonel's grim assessment spread quietly among experienced officers. They began privately acknowledging what many had suspected for months. Germany was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting to delay defeat. The offensive itself reflected that desperation. Hitler had ordered the Ardennes attack despite the objections of several senior generals, many of whom considered the plan unrealistic. They warned that fuel shortages, manpower losses, and Allied strength made such an operation nearly impossible. But Hitler believed one dramatic victory in the West might fracture the Allied coalition and force negotiations. Field commanders obeyed. But many no longer believed. Now staring at the captured American gasoline, the colonel saw proof not merely that the Ardennes offensive would fail, but that Germany's entire strategic position was hopeless. Even if the attack achieved temporary breakthroughs, even if German tanks reached farther west, even if more depots were captured, the imbalance was too great. Germany could win engagements. It could not outproduce, outfuel, or outlast its enemies. The war had become arithmetic, and arithmetic no longer favored the Reich. Some soldiers later remembered senior officers becoming increasingly subdued after the initial excitement over the fuel haul. The celebration faded as reality returned. Vehicles were refueled, yes, but the roads ahead were still contested. Fuel tanks were fuller, but the strategic picture remained unchanged. Everyone who understood logistics knew the same truth. This fuel would be burned, and then the shortage would return. For the colonel, the captured depot marked a psychological turning point. It stripped away the last illusion that battlefield brilliance could reverse Germany's fate. The Reich had become tactically dangerous but strategically bankrupt. Its armies could still strike hard. They could still kill. They could still frighten their enemies. But they could no longer sustain victory. As the armored columns pressed deeper into Belgium, running on captured American gasoline, the colonel reportedly summarized the situation in words remembered long after the war. If the enemy can lose this much fuel and continue fighting, then we have already lost. It was a realization many German commanders would come to share in the final months of the war. The Battle of the Bulge was not Germany's return to strength. It was the last violent surge of an exhausted army spending resources it could never replace. And every mile advanced on stolen fuel only delayed the inevitable. Because the true lesson of the captured depot was not that Germany had found salvation. It was that Germany had run out of its own. The captured American fuel bought the German armored spearheads time, but only time. For a brief moment during the Battle of the Bulge, the seizure of Allied gasoline allowed German columns to keep moving west. Engines that should have gone silent roared back to life. Tanks rolled forward again through the snow-covered Ardennes. Officers revised their maps and schedules, believing the offensive still had a chance. But fuel alone could not repair what Germany had already lost. The Reich's logistical system was collapsing on every front. Even as Kampfgruppe paper and other spearheads advanced on captured gasoline, the broader German supply network behind them was in chaos. Railways had been shattered by Allied bombing. Bridges and roads were cratered or congested. Fuel depots inside Germany had been repeatedly attacked from the air. Transport trucks were too few, and many sat idle for lack of fuel themselves. Supplying the front had become an increasingly impossible task. The Wehrmacht was no longer a machine running low on fuel. It was a machine breaking apart. German armored doctrine had always depended on momentum, fast-moving columns, coordinated breakthroughs, rapid exploitation. But by late 1944, nearly every part of that system was under strain. Veteran crews had been lost in earlier campaigns. Replacements were younger, less trained, and often rushed into combat. Spare parts were scarce. Mechanics worked miracles to keep tanks running, but even successful repairs meant little if the vehicles could not be fueled. The Ardennes Offensive exposed every weakness at once. The terrain itself worked against the Germans. The narrow forest roads of Belgium and Luxembourg were unsuitable for the massive concentration of armor Hitler had committed. Vehicles became trapped in endless traffic jams. A single destroyed truck or knocked-out tank could block an entire route for hours. Fuel trucks struggled to reach advancing spearheads through roads packed with armor, artillery, infantry, and horse-drawn wagons. Every delay devoured gasoline. The captured American stockpile that had seemed enormous now disappeared rapidly into engines, fuel lines, and burning exhaust. Tiger II heavy tanks consumed extraordinary amounts of fuel simply to maneuver through rough winter terrain. Panthers, half-tracks, and trucks added their own relentless demand. By the time some German units resumed movement, much of the miracle fuel was already gone. And the farther they advanced, the worse the problem became. Fuel had to move with the spearhead. Capturing gasoline was one thing, transporting it through combat zones to dozens or hundreds of vehicles under fire was another. Tanker trucks became prime targets for Allied aircraft and artillery. Supply columns were ambushed on narrow roads. In some cases, German units found themselves with fuel in rear areas, but no practical way to get it to the front fast enough. Then the weather changed. The cloud cover and fog that had shielded the offensive in its opening days began to lift. Allied air power returned in force. American and British fighter bombers swept over the battlefield, attacking roads, bridges, and vehicle columns with devastating effect. German convoys attempting to move fuel and ammunition were hit repeatedly. Burning tankers lit roadsides with towering flames. Drivers abandoned vehicles and fled into ditches as aircraft circled overhead. Each destroyed truck meant not only lost supplies, but fewer vehicles available for the next delivery. German troops soon gave the fighter bombers a grim nickname: the Jarbos. And everywhere the Jarbos appeared, movement slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, American resistance stiffened. The initial shock of the German breakthrough faded as Allied commanders rushed reinforcements into the Ardennes. U.S. infantry held key crossroads. Engineers demolished bridges before German armor could seize them. Artillery saturated likely approach routes. At Bastogne, American defenders blocked one of the offensive's most critical road networks, delaying German movements and forcing costly diversions. The offensive's timetable began to collapse. Hitler had demanded a rapid thrust to the Meuse River and beyond. Instead, German units found themselves bogged down in attritional fighting they could not afford. Tanks burned fuel in battles for villages that should have been bypassed. Hours turned into days. Every lost minute meant more Allied reinforcements, more resistance, and more fuel consumed. Then the inevitable happened. German armored spearheads once again began running dry. Vehicles that had been revived by captured gasoline were abandoned for a second time. Crews siphoned fuel from damaged or disabled tanks to keep a few operational. Some units destroyed their own equipment rather than let it fall intact into Allied hands. Mechanics worked in freezing mud to cannibalize parts from immobilized vehicles that would never move again. The pattern repeated across the front. Brilliant machines, Panthers, Tigers, self-propelled guns, stood silent by roadsides, useless, because their fuel tanks were empty. No tactical skill could change that. By late December, it had become clear that the offensive was failing. German units had penetrated deeply, but nowhere near enough to achieve their strategic goals. They had not reached Antwerp. They had not split the Allied armies. They had not forced negotiations. Instead, they had spent irreplaceable reserves of men, tanks, and fuel for gains they could not hold. The Ardennes had become not a turning point, but a final expenditure of strength. Senior commanders knew the damage was irreversible. Germany had committed many of its last effective armored reserves to the offensive. Losses in tanks and vehicles were severe, but the true disaster lay in logistics. Fuel stocks consumed in the attack could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Synthetic fuel production remained crippled by bombing. Romanian oil was gone. Transport networks were shattered. The Wehrmacht had burned through precious reserves for a gamble that failed. And the Allies only grew stronger. Fresh American divisions arrived continuously. New tanks rolled from factories in the United States by the thousands. Fuel convoys crossed Europe in endless columns. What Germany treated as a strategic emergency, the Allies treated as routine supply. The captured American depot had never been enough to alter that balance. It had only postponed the inevitable. For the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, the lesson was harsh and unforgettable. Courage, experience, and tactical brilliance still mattered, but none of them could substitute for logistics. No army, however skilled, could sustain mechanized warfare without fuel. No offensive, however daring, could outrun arithmetic forever. Germany's final Western offensive had proven the truth in brutal fashion. Fuel could power tanks. Fuel could launch attacks. Fuel could win battles for a day. But fuel alone could not save a collapsing empire. By January 1945, the German retreat had resumed. The roads of the Ardennes were littered with burned-out wrecks, abandoned armor, shattered trucks, and frozen corpses, grim evidence of an army that had gambled everything and lost. And among the twisted metal left behind were countless vehicles that had not been destroyed by enemy fire, but simply starved of the fuel needed to fight. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. What had begun as Hitler's final great gamble in the West ended in failure, leaving behind shattered forests, ruined villages, and thousands of dead on both sides. The German offensive had achieved surprise and temporary gains, but it had failed in every strategic objective. Antwerp remained in Allied hands, the Western Front held, and Germany had spent precious reserves it could never replace. For many German officers, the Ardennes was the moment they knew the war was truly finished. The defeat was not merely tactical, it was terminal. The Wehrmacht had committed some of its best remaining armored formations to the offensive: elite panzer divisions, veteran crews, experienced officers, and valuable heavy tanks. Many never recovered from the losses. Hundreds of vehicles had been destroyed, abandoned, or captured. Tens of thousands of trained soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The fuel consumed in the attack had drained already desperate reserves. And in return, Germany gained nothing permanent. The retreat that followed was brutal. German units pulled back through snow, mud, and constant Allied pressure. Vehicles too damaged or empty to move were blown up by their own crews. Rearguard actions became desperate, delaying fights. Officers who months earlier had spoken of restoring the front now focused only on preserving fragments of their commands from complete destruction. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the military one. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised miracle weapons, decisive counterattacks, and dramatic reversals. Hitler insisted that Germany still possessed the will and genius to change the war's course. But the Ardennes offensive had been the last plausible chance to prove him right, and it had failed. Even many loyal officers could no longer pretend otherwise. The grim realization that had come to commanders during the offensive now spread through the ranks. Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting through the final chapter of defeat. Events after the Bulge confirmed it rapidly. In the east, the Soviet Union launched the Vistula Oder offensive in January 1945, smashing through German defenses in Poland and advancing with terrifying speed toward Berlin. Entire German armies collapsed under the weight of Soviet manpower, artillery, and armor. Refugees flooded westward in panic, clogging roads already packed with retreating military units. On the Western Front, Allied armies resumed their advance into Germany itself. American, British, Canadian, and French forces crossed rivers, breached defensive lines, and rolled steadily toward the Rhine. Allied air superiority made daylight movement increasingly suicidal for German troops and vehicles. Supply depots, rail lines, and roads were bombed relentlessly. The Reich was being crushed from both directions. And still, the fuel crisis worsened. Whatever reserves remained after the Ardennes disappeared quickly in the chaos of retreat and emergency redeployments. Tank formations often had only enough gasoline for local counterattacks before being immobilized again. Luftwaffe squadrons that still existed on paper flew only sporadically. Some aircraft were abandoned without ever leaving the ground because there was no aviation fuel left for meaningful operations. Germany still had weapons. It no longer had the means to use them effectively. By the spring of 1945, scenes once unimaginable became common. Advanced German tanks sat hidden in forests or village streets, reserved for single defensive actions because commanders lacked fuel for maneuver. Elite units were reduced to fighting as static infantry. Mechanized warfare, the doctrine that had once brought Europe to its knees, was gone. The Wehrmacht was now defending with fragments of a broken machine. The colonel's realization during the captured fuel episode had proven correct. That American depot had not been a miracle. It had been a warning. A nation that could abandon tens of thousands of gallons of fuel and keep advancing without pause was operating on a scale Germany could never match. The captured gasoline had briefly masked the truth, but it had not changed it. Germany's enemies were too numerous, too productive, too well supplied. The outcome of the war was no longer determined by courage or battlefield skill. It was determined by industrial and logistical supremacy. By April 1945, Allied forces entered the heart of Germany. American troops crossed the Elbe, Soviet armies encircled Berlin, German cities burned under bombardment, communications collapsed, fuel shortages became absolute. Some commanders could not even relocate headquarters because no transport remained. Orders went undelivered because dispatch riders lacked gasoline for motorcycles or cars. The Third Reich was physically disintegrating. Adolf Hitler remained in Berlin, still issuing impossible commands to armies that no longer existed or could no longer move. He ordered counterattacks from phantom formations, demanded offensives from units without ammunition, and expected maneuver warfare from divisions whose tanks sat dry and abandoned. Reality no longer obeyed ideology. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the aftermath, historians and military analysts repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Germany had not lost simply because of battlefield defeats. It had lost because modern industrial war could not be won without overwhelming logistical support. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and brilliant generals meant little if they could not be supplied, fueled, and replaced. The moment a German commander stared at 50,000 gallons of captured American gasoline and understood that even such a prize changed nothing, that moment symbolized the war's true outcome. Because in that instant, the illusion died. Germany had once conquered much of Europe through speed, shock, and operational brilliance. But by 1944 and 1945, the war had become a contest of endurance, production, and logistics, and in that contest, the Reich was hopelessly outmatched. The captured fuel was never salvation. It was proof of defeat. Proof that Germany had become dependent on the resources of its enemies just to continue fighting. Proof that the Allies possessed material power beyond anything the Reich could overcome. Proof that the final offensives of Nazi Germany were not signs of strength, but the desperate thrashing of a collapsing power. And so, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, amid burning wrecks and stolen gasoline, one of the clearest symbols of Germany's fate emerged. Not in a dramatic surrender, Not in a speech, not in Berlin's ruins, but in the realization that 50,000 gallons of captured fuel could keep an army moving for a few more hours, and still not save it from defeat.